There's a man in the Bible who spent 13 years of his life waiting for an explanation that never came. Sold by his own brothers, falsely accused, forgotten in a prison cell by the one person who could have gotten him out. And through all 13 of those years, God never once told him why. That's the part of Joseph's story most people skip past on their way to the happy ending. We love the part where he becomes second in command of Egypt. We love the reunion with his brothers, the tears, the forgiveness. But we rush past the years where none of that was visible yet. The years where Joseph had absolutely no evidence that any of it was coming. So here's the real question buried in this story. How do you find peace in a season where God is silent and your circumstances keep getting worse? And here's a stranger question sitting right underneath that one almost nobody asks. We're never once told what Joseph prayed during any of it, not a single recorded word. So if he wasn't getting answers, and we don't even know what he was asking, what was actually holding him together? Keep that question in your back pocket, because the answer isn't going to arrive until we've walked through the whole story. Let's set the scene. We're somewhere around the 18th or 19th century BC, in the land of Canaan, in a large, complicated, blended family. Jacob has 12 sons from 4 different women, and he makes no secret of the fact that Joseph, one of the youngest, is his favorite. He gives Joseph a richly ornamented robe, a garment that in that culture wasn't just a nice gift, it was a public statement. This son does not work in the fields like the rest of you. This son is set apart. You can imagine what that does to 11 brothers watching their father play favorites in plain sight. And then Joseph makes it worse, not through malice exactly, but through the tone deafness of youth. He has dreams, vivid ones, where his brothers' sheaves of wheat bow down to his, where the sun and moon and 11 stars bow down to him. And he tells his brothers about them, repeatedly. The text says plainly that his brothers hated him for it, and couldn't speak a kind word to him. That's the powder keg Joseph is living inside of before anything dramatic even happens. But here's the detail worth sitting with. Whatever those dreams meant, and they would eventually mean exactly what they said, Joseph had no way yet of knowing how brutal the road to their fulfillment was actually going to be. One day, Jacob sends Joseph out to check on his brothers, who are grazing the flock some distance away. When the brothers see him coming, robe and all, something in them finally snaps. Some of them want to kill him outright. Reuben, the oldest, talks them into throwing him into an empty cistern instead, secretly planning to come back later and rescue him. But before that plan can happen, a caravan of traders passes by, and the brothers sell Joseph to them instead. 17 years old, ripped from his family, sold like property, hauled off toward Egypt. Put yourself inside that pit for a second. Whatever those dreams meant, they clearly did not mean this. If Joseph was holding on to some promise that his life was headed somewhere significant, this moment should have felt like proof that the promise was a lie. Sometimes obedience to a calling doesn't move you forward at all. Sometimes it feels like it buries you first. That's layer 1. But it's not even the hardest part yet. In Egypt, Joseph ends up as a slave in the household of a man named Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh, in a nation that was, at this point in history, the single greatest superpower on earth. Monumental architecture, a sophisticated bureaucracy, a military that dominated the region. For a Hebrew slave to rise to any position of trust inside a household like that would already be remarkable. And here's where the story does something unexpected. Genesis says plainly that the Lord was with Joseph, and Potiphar noticed it, promoting him until Joseph is running the entire household. For a moment, it almost looks like things are turning around. Then Potiphar's wife makes repeated advances toward Joseph, and when he refuses her, consistently, on moral grounds, she turns around and falsely accuses him of assaulting her. Joseph loses everything again. Not because he did something wrong, because he did something right, and it cost him anyway. Sit with that for a second, because this is the detail most retellings smooth over too quickly. Joseph didn't get thrown in prison for a mistake. He got thrown in prison for his integrity. Doing the right thing doesn't always produce an immediate reward. Sometimes it produces a cell. In prison, the same pattern repeats. The text says again that the Lord was with Joseph, and he ends up trusted, essentially running the place from the inside. Two of Pharaoh's officials land in the same prison, a cupbearer and a baker, and both have troubling dreams. Joseph, gifted at interpreting dreams since childhood, tells them what their dreams mean. The baker will be executed. The cupbearer will be restored to his position in 3 days. Joseph asks the cupbearer one simple favor. Remember me when you're back in Pharaoh's good graces. Mention my name. Get me out of here. 3 days later, exactly as Joseph said, the cupbearer is restored. And then he forgets Joseph completely. Genesis says it takes 2 full years before that memory even resurfaces. Here's a detail worth pausing on, because it's stranger than it first appears. The very gift that should have gotten Joseph out of prison immediately is the same gift that, for 2 more years, kept him sitting in it. His talent worked exactly as promised. The timing simply wasn't his to control. Sometimes the thing you're most gifted at isn't the thing that rescues you on your schedule. It's the thing that quietly proves you're ready, long before anyone comes looking for you. Faithfulness like that often goes unnoticed for a long time before it ever becomes visible to anyone else. If you're keeping count, this is now 3 separate moments where doing the right thing, or being genuinely gifted, or simply being faithful, produced no visible payoff. A pit, a false accusation, a forgotten promise. That's not a bad week. That's over a decade of a man's life amounting, as far as he could tell, to nothing. So why does Genesis go out of its way to repeat the exact same phrase in 2 of Joseph's darkest settings, word for word? That's not an accident of storytelling. That's the whole story hiding in plain sight. Twice, in the 2 darkest settings of Joseph's life, slavery and prison, the text stops the narrative just long enough to tell you one specific thing. The Lord was with him. Not the Lord rescued him. Not the Lord explained himself to him. The Lord was with him, present, in the exact moments where every visible circumstance suggested the opposite. But here's what should really stop you. This isn't a Joseph-shaped pattern. It's a Bible-shaped one. Abraham was promised a nation, and then waited decades, well into old age, before that promise showed the first sign of coming true. Moses was called to lead his people out of Egypt, and then spent 40 silent years herding sheep in the desert before that call ever activated. David was anointed king as a teenager, and then spent years running from the very throne he'd already been promised, hunted by the man currently sitting on it. Even Jesus, according to the Gospels, lived 30 quiet, undocumented years before his public ministry ever began. Promise, then silence, then waiting, then, only after all of that, fulfillment. Joseph isn't an exception to how God works. He's a textbook case of it. Do you see what that does to how you read your own uncertain seasons? Everything changes for Joseph, eventually, and fast. Pharaoh has a disturbing dream nobody can interpret. The cupbearer finally remembers Joseph, and within the space of a single day, Joseph goes from forgotten prisoner to the second most powerful man in the greatest empire on earth, tasked with saving the entire region from a coming famine. Years later, that same famine drives his brothers, the very ones who sold him, to Egypt looking for grain, and they end up standing in front of the brother they betrayed, without recognizing him. When Joseph finally reveals who he is, he doesn't do what you might expect from a man with every reason and every ounce of power to seek revenge. He says one sentence that reframes his entire 13 years in a single breath. You meant this for evil, but God meant it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Read that sentence slowly, because it is doing something remarkable. Joseph isn't saying the evil his brothers did wasn't really evil. He calls it exactly what it was. He isn't saying God caused them to do it either. He's saying something more precise. 2 things were true in that pit, in that house, in that prison, at the very same time. His brothers meant it for harm, and God was, all along, weaving that same harm into something that would save an entire region from starvation, including the very family that threw him away. Here's the sentence worth carrying out of this whole story. Joseph never received peace because he understood God's plan. He received peace because God's presence arrived before God's explanation ever did. That single line rewrites everything you just watched him go through. He wasn't calm because he could see the ending. He couldn't. He was sustained because the presence that stayed with him in the pit and the prison was trustworthy, whether or not it ever explained itself along the way. But Joseph's ending isn't actually the point, and here's what most people still miss. Zoom out far enough, and Joseph's whole arc becomes a pattern you'll see again, centuries later, in the very shape of the gospel itself. Betrayed by his own, falsely accused and unjustly condemned, lowered before he's ever exalted, raised up not for his own benefit, but to become the means of saving the very people who wronged him, and, at the end of it all, extending forgiveness instead of the revenge he had every right to take. That's not a coincidence Scripture wants you to miss. It's the same shape the whole story of redemption keeps returning to, echoed forward, generation after generation, until it reaches its fullest expression in Christ himself. This changes how you read the entire story, not just Joseph's chapter of it. If this is opening something up for you, take a second to subscribe so next study finds you. Here's where this actually lands for the uncertainty you might be sitting in right now. You are probably not going to get Joseph's ending mapped out for you in advance. Most people in the middle of their own pit, their own false accusation, their own forgotten years, don't get a preview of the rescue coming. That's exactly the point. Joseph didn't either. The piece he eventually modeled for us wasn't built on knowing how the story would end. It was built on the same quiet confidence the text kept naming, even when nothing visible had changed yet. That reframes what peace in uncertainty actually looks like. It was never about predicting your own future. It's about trusting the character of the one present with you regardless of what that future turns out to be. Joseph eventually learned why. 13 years of silence finally resolved into an explanation he could stand in front of his brothers and speak out loud. But most of us never get that. Most of us close our own chapter of waiting without ever hearing the reason behind it. And that was never actually what this story was teaching. It was never a lesson about waiting for an explanation. It was always a lesson about who to trust while you're still waiting for one. Joseph never told us what he prayed in that pit or that prison. And maybe that's the point too. The words weren't what carried him. The presence was. If this study helped you see Joseph's story differently, take a second to subscribe so next study finds you, and drop a comment below. Even one word helps more than you'd think. Share it with someone who's sitting in their own version of that pit right now. I'll see you next Sunday.